different topic. Pest control, predator-free New Zealand, 1080 ecosystems. What's necessary and what's not. Last year, Kim and I were at a conference up in Auckland, an animal law conference, and Jane Goodall was there and speaking. And Jane Goodall, as I think most of us know, is an iconic figure in the world of both environmental and animal rights. She blends both. She's a vegan. She's as opposed to the treatment of individual animals as she is to the destruction of their habitat out in the wild. But she did make a little bit of an exception in saying that she recognises New Zealand's unique ecology. There is a need to control invasive organisms that are destroying our forests and things. I don't know. This is a story that, you know, a view that is probably the majority view. It's certainly one that you hear a lot in the media, and you get a lot if you're talking to conservationists or scientists. It's one that I happen to disagree with. My view is a minority view in New Zealand, but there are a growing number of scientists writing on this topic overseas. And while everyone acknowledges that there are some types of organism that they pose a disease threat or an economic threat that is so large, you know, some of these things can affect our crops, and, you know, why go up a whole chunk of the economy? I think realistically, you do have to actually do something to stop those, or an organism that poses a threat of a deadly disease or something. I mean, if a tsetse fly or the particular type of Anopheles mosquito that transmits malaria, if with climate change they end up in New Zealand, you know, I'm not going to be campaigning against the pest control measures that try to eliminate them. But we're talking possums here, and rats, and for the most part mammals in our forests. And the narrative goes along the lines that these are foreign invaders. Our forests didn't have animals like deer and possums and rats and stoats and things before. They're destroying the wild. They're destroying the ecosystem. The forests are all going to die, and all the indigenous species are going to die. And that's the catastrophe version, the calamitous version of what's going on. But actually, it's a big beat-up. It's not true. I think the total number of species have become extinct since humans stopped exterminating them. This is wild New Zealand animals. In the last century, there's two. One was a bird, not a full species, and one was the grey-winged fish. The populations of our indigenous species have reduced a lot, no question. Polluting streams from pastoral agriculture has been very bad for our fish, and pastoral agriculture has also cleared a lot of forests in the last 100 years, which was habitat for these creatures, so we've reduced their habitat. And with climate change now sort of kicking in, there are probably other changes occurring to their habitat. Really what's happened is we've driven our native animals into the most marginal and inhospitable environments possible, basically the cold mountains. And they've ended up in a kind of a death row alley fight with these introduced mammals that have come in. And we're saying that the introduced mammals are the problem. The problem is that they've got nowhere to live, and they're living like takahe. Take takahe as an example. You know, like the big fat version of the puke. Their native habitat was thought to be the Murchison Mountains down south, up high, cold, small populations huddled there. And they were sort of seen initially when they were discovered as being a species with rare requirements that just could only be met in the Murchison Mountains, and you know, that we had to look after them. And I agree, we did have to look after them. But the diagnosis of their problem was totally wrong. As paleontologists started digging up, doing archaeological digs all around, They found that takahe were as numerous as a flock of chickens down here where we are now. Everywhere where there was forest on the lowlands, there were takahe running around. It's just they got eaten when the first humans arrived here, and their habitats got burnt. When Maori came here, they burned off about a third of all the forests, and within about 100 to 120 years, they've wiped out all the big birds that they could get, as well as most of the big marine mammals. This is just, they weren't being evil. They just turned up in a land that didn't have the sort of foods that were available in the more tropical areas they come from, and they were just doing what anyone would do. They were just trying to make their environment one that fed them and they felt more secure in. And unfortunately, they created this big impact. So that's when most of our native birds went extinct, during that period. Europeans then came along and then polished off about another third of the indigenous forest, for pastoral farming mostly, and probably another, well, pretty much the remainder of the native birds that became extinct between the early 1800s and the early 1900s during that period. Then since then, most of our native species have been kind of hanging in there and just hoping that we don't degrade their habitat anymore, but we have been. And it seems to me that having a cruel and costly war to eliminate these animals, which are unnatural here, and they are preying on birds and things, but not, possums preying on birds. No. Some do, but it really is a small kind of percentage effect. Possums don't even do the tree destruction that they're often accused of. There's a phenomenon called forest dieback, and possums are often accused of being the cause of it. Well, the Department of Conservation, a decade or so back, began doing some systematic investigation of it, and they reported the results of one of these study areas. I think it was two or three annual reports ago. It didn't make any headlines, but this particular forest, they divided it into two bits. They eliminated possums from one part, and the other part had unrestrained possums on it. And they maintained the line for a decade. And then they went back in to count every sapling, every tree, every leaf virtually, to see what the differences were. And there were none. On both sides of the line, the trees have actually prospered equally. Sure, possums were eating them, but they were not at a rate that they couldn't regenerate at. The other side to that is there have been instances that are now well documented, but weren't initially, of dieback occurring in forests where there are no possums. There are other factors that can cause this sort of thing. Just unfortunate climatic events, weather events, invasions of microorganisms sometimes that can get in there, funguses and things that can have a widespread effect and a big hit. So the perception of these creatures as destroying our forests is not really, even though a lot of scientists buy into it, at the same time when they actually do it because they have ecological theory informing them. And it's unfortunate for a lot of them, it's the ecological theory of the 1950s. And there are people now overseas, newer, younger, brighter people coming in and challenging the whole, based on empirical results, just challenging that whole 1950s model. The 1950s model, which goes back to the Romantic poets and Rousseau and so forth back in the 1800s, is this idea that nature is a balanced state and things don't really change, and everything has its vital place in that arrangement, and if one of them goes, everything else will sort of collapse. And so ecosystems are fragile, they're intricately put together over millions of years, and we tamper with them, or possums tamper with them at our peril. And it's not actually true. the more that the actual on-the-ground, decades-long research goes into ecosystems, they find that there are critters coming in and out of them, plants floating in and seeding and replacing other plants. They're constantly dynamic, chaotic assemblages, and so the paradigm of ecosystem balance has been replaced by one of ecological fit. And what ecological fit means, basically nature's full of things going back and forward and round, and whatever happens to fit in a particular place and time, with particular weather conditions and soil conditions, etc., will get established, and provided it doesn't get wiped out by whatever's there, it'll hang in there. It might even wipe out something that's there, but it'll be there, then it'll probably move on as conditions change. It's a much more dynamic and free-flowing kind of concept of ecology, and it puts the emphasis more not on particular species being there, but on an overall abundance being there. So, like a bus station or a train station, if you sent an ecologist in to try to sort of make sure that they were sustaining the Wellington train station, they would probably try and get each individual who was there on the day that they did their survey to stay there for the rest of their lives, not recognising that this flow, people are coming and going all the time, and there's a lot of flux. So the model that a lot of current ecological scientists, guys now who and women who are sort of getting into my vintage, and they've dominated the discussion for the last few decades, and now looking at retirement and probably satisfactory, thinking, we've got predator-free New Zealand now. We're going to get some ecological balance at last. But what kind of ecological balance do you get? Can you get in a system which is automatically chaotic and dynamic anyway, but also something like 60% of the big species, the moa, for example, that used to do what deer currently do, eat the leaves and the saplings and trample over things, they're gone. How can you ever have an ecological balance with just the remnant birds and beasts that are there now? It can never be the same as it was. And if there really was a fragile, vulnerable balance back in 1300 when the first Polynesians turned up, the prospect of ever getting it back are long gone. Predator-free New Zealand isn't going to bring it back. All they're going to do is basically clear the ground of the foreigners and have some refugees, a sort of a remnant population of refugee species living up in the mountains. So I have a fundamentally different view of predator-free New Zealand. Underlying it or associated with it is my view that animals, if a holocaust is a solution to anything, it's not a solution. A program that requires millions of animals to be poisoned and shot and trapped every year ad infinitum, forever and ever and ever, just to maintain the fiction of a natural, balanced ecosystem out there in the woods, is just a laugh. It's a joke in my view, and it is fundamentally unethical and inhumane. So that is fundamentally why I'm kind of opposed to it. If it wasn't inhumane, if all they were doing was getting rid of weeds, plants, I would probably just say they're idiots and wouldn't get quite so invested in it. But I actually, knowing that the huge scale of suffering that's going on out there, based on false ecological theory and on empirical results, which actually the Department of Conservation themselves has found contradict some of their core assumptions. To me, it's just a criminal thing. So I think this is a discussion that also needs to be had, and I think if whatever opportunities you guys have in your browsings and readings, look into this, do a little bit of digging. Don't just look for the people who are critiquing the party line. There's a woman called Emma Maris who's written a book called Rambunctious Garden. She's an American, Californian. She was out here just a few months ago, and she actually came along and spoke at the Ministry of the Environment to a bunch of very sceptical young analysts who all been brought up on the predator-free kind of view. I don't know if she changed any hearts and minds, but she's trying to get the conversation started. And there's a fellow, a Dr. Jamie Steer, who works for the Wellington Regional Council as a biodiversity advisor, and he also is he's challenging the status quite a big time, and occasionally Kim Hill interviewed him, and she's having Kim Hill and Jesse Mulligan, both on the national program, both of whom have interviewed a lot of scientists and a lot of big thinkers who are very much in predatory New Zealand. They talked to Jamie, and you could just sort of hear the sarcasm and the sort of scorn in their voices as they asked the questions. But he was quite unfavorable, and he just kept bouncing it back. It's true. This is a collective folly. It's a Pied Piper thing. You know, all the children of Camelot are following the piper, and it's not taking us to a good place. The last sort of question that I raised, not really to deliver any particularly big thoughts on, but it's just this whole idea that I've certainly come up with when I've been on stalls, and you have people come up and put to you the idea of humane farming, and it could come through sustainable farming or organic farming, but it's the idea that there is a type of farming that's benign and kind, and it's only sort of factory farming, it's only big industrial farming that's the problem, and they're normally sweet people who profess a concern for animal welfare. And I remember one woman telling me, as she signed a petition, I agree with everything you're saying. I kill all my own animals myself. So that one's a difficult one sometimes. You get into a sort of a head-banging confrontation with people like that, or do you somehow try to grab the little flicker of goodwill that's there and try to sort of turn it and work it a little bit more towards the idea of thinking of plant-based farming as an even better form of farming than what they're doing. Tricky to do sometimes when you're having to think on your feet. But there is this very romantic myth. I think there are three myths that in the sort of environmental and agricultural sort of sustainable agriculture area, which all need to be reassessed. One of them is the idea of an ecological, a balanced ecosystem in this sort of this natural pristine state. I don't think that is true. Another of them is the idea that livestock farming and dairy in particular are sort of backbones of the economy. You know, all meat production in New Zealand, the number of jobs it provides in a country of 4 million people is 25,000. In Canterbury, the dairy industry, it contributes about 15% to the GDP of Canterbury district. So if those farms were changed to some other product, they'd still be contributing a percentage to the GDP. They wouldn't just disappear. But they employ only about 5%, less than 5% of the workforce of Canterbury. So they aren't actually the backbone. They're significant players, but amongst a lot of significant players. And we do not depend on them, we're subsidising them. So the idea that they're the backbone of the economy, that's another myth that has to be challenged. And of course, the noble savage one that I referred to before, which I think is tied in with the idea of our sort of Europeanised version is this idea of the humane, organic, natural farm. And we have this noble savage view of non-Europeans, sort of the state of nature. They both are myths that suggest that people in the old days were doing it right. And in the old days, animals somehow didn't mind being slaughtered and didn't mind the way they were treated. All fiction. To create a sort of a vein of argument that there are still ways of exploiting animals that are okay. All we have to do is somehow get the system back onto those ways, and then we can continue having our steaks and our bacon and all the rest of it. I think they're not. Those myths are pervasive, and they create problems for us when we're trying to do our outreach at times. But we've got to be non-heated in the way we challenge them, but they do have to be challenged. So those are my thoughts on all those things, and if you've got any other questions or any thoughts of your own, then I'm keen to hear them.